Good shooting, brah. Yeah, man. Lots of buzzard meat.
During the early to mid-90s, video games suffered from a bit of a plague. A virus, if you will. As CD-ROMs were slowly but surely becoming the new standard, they provided several times more storage space than the usual cartridges, while costing a fraction as much. And with games becoming bigger and more packed with content than ever before, CDs also facilitated a more cinematic presentation. CD-based games were capable of playing pre-recorded music and sound effects, as well as the spectacle of full-motion video playback. And so, with the steady rise of the CD-ROM would come an influx of video games that revolved around pre-recorded cutscenes. Video games as a whole have been trying to contend with other forms of visual media for decades, particularly movies and television. Games have by and large been seen as kids' stuff, and the Hollywood-style ambitions of many story-driven games is the medium's attempt to legitimize gaming as a serious art form. However, many of those attempts came off as little more than a pale imitation of film. None more so than the aforementioned plague. The plague of the dreaded FMV game. With consoles like the Sega CD and the PlayStation spreading CD-ROMs beyond just the realm of PCs, we would see a slew of games that revolved around full-motion video. Many of these would be structured much like a choose-your-own-adventure book, with a certain segment of the story playing out before allowing the player one of several decisions that will alter the story's current course along one of several pre-scripted paths. On paper, it may not sound like a bad idea, but the so-called FMV games held a fairly poor reputation, and for good reason. Due to the pre-recorded nature of FMVs, the story cutscenes couldn't actually respond to player input or change in real time. The game would simply play a video file, and the player's so-called choices simply decided which video file would be played next. In other words, there was no actual gameplay happening. You may as well just have the player select each scene from a folder of AVI files. But even that wouldn't have worked, though, because the presentation of these FMVs were almost never interesting enough to make them entertaining on their own. Many FMV games used live-action footage, and yet lacked the budget or acting talent to make anywhere near Hollywood or even TV-quality stories. The scenes were almost always filmed on incredibly cheap sets with incredibly cheap costumes. It was all a piss-poor attempt to bring video games to the same level of prestige as film, and still stands as some of the most embarrassing things to come out of the gaming medium. And so it's odd that Capcom's 1996 horror video game, Resident Evil, wound up being such a huge success because in many ways it shares a lot in common with those terrible FMV games. Sure, it may limit its bizarre live-action nonsense to strictly its opening and ending scenes, with the rest of the story being told through actual in-engine graphics, but it all still features that same low-budget feel, with writing and acting that is so stilted it can feel like the game was made by aliens or something. But Resident Evil showed us that even with all the cheesy writing and weird acting, you can actually build a pretty interesting game around it all if you try. Resident Evil, or Biohazard as it's known in Japan, is a horror game set largely within one large mansion on the outskirts of a fictional American town known as Raccoon City, and follows a group of Special Task Force officers known as STARS, the Special Tactics and Rescue Service. When the STARS Bravo team goes missing while investigating a series of strange monster sightings in the Arklay Mountains, Alpha Team is sent in to figure out what happened. They're soon attacked by what appears to be a group of rabid dogs, but they prove to be frighteningly resilient, seemingly unaffected by gunfire, and quickly killing one of Alpha Team's members, Joseph. The remaining members flee, soon coming across a nearby mansion, which they use to seek refuge from the beasts. Now trapped, the team needs to find a way to safely signal their helicopter pilot, who is circling the skies in a panic in the aftermath of the animal attack. It turns out the mansion isn't safe either, infested by zombies and other strange monsters, and the remaining STARS members soon uncover a sinister conspiracy that will leave them wondering who they can still trust. Resident Evil is a self-described survival horror game played entirely in 3D. Characters are fully polygonal 3D models with 2D pre-rendered backgrounds. The game takes a lot of influence from Alone in the Dark, a series of early 90s PC games developed by Infogrames. While Resident Evil is the game that coined the term survival horror, Alone in the Dark could be considered the actual first game of the genre, and revolves around the player trying to escape a mansion full of various supernatural creatures. While its static camera angles were the result of technical limitations, the team used that limitation to their advantage as a means of building tension or unease. Resident Evil acts in much the same way. Your character travels through various pre-rendered rooms, with the camera snapping to a new angle whenever you reach the end of the previous one. The survival aspect of survival horror is a more multifaceted term than it appears. It doesn't just mean the player must literally survive by avoiding game overs. After all, that's the general goal in most any video game. No, the survival stands for resource management. As you explore the mansion, you come across a small variety of firearms with which to defend yourself. Ammo is scattered throughout the game in finite amounts, as well as herbs with which to heal injuries. And with the majority of the game being largely non-linear, and many enemies being able to tank about half a handgun clip before dying, the player must be smart about which enemies to defeat and which to evade in order to avoid running out of resources completely. Even saving your game is a limited commodity, as the typewriters that your character uses to record their progress require single-use ink ribbons that must be found and picked up like any other item. Pair this with the game's complete lack of a continue option when you die, and this turns what would otherwise be a simple, technical, quality-of-life feature in any other game into an actual strategic gameplay decision. The player's inventory is also limited, but unlike Alone in the Dark, where item capacity was determined by how heavy each item was, here it's just a set number of items that can be carried at a time. The player can combine up to 3 herbs together to make room for more items if need be, and keys can be discarded completely once they're no longer needed, but otherwise the player must drop excess items into one of various item chests located in safe rooms. These item chests are all linked, so items dropped in one box can be retrieved from any other box, but this still leads to a lot of strategic item juggling when it comes to completing the game's objectives. Aside from Alone in the Dark, another major influence on this game was an old Capcom game released for the Famicom called Sweet Home. Sweet Home was a licensed tie-in game to promote a Japanese film of the same name, and revolved around a group of characters trapped in a haunted house, forced to solve puzzles and avoid enemies to escape. Resident Evil was the result of Capcom wanting to revisit the basic concepts of Sweet Home, but without the ties to a pre-existing IP. So much like Sweet Home, you have to locate keys and disarm traps to uncover more items that will help you progress. The entire game is designed like a puzzle box, with everything you discover linking to something else in the game somewhere. Several puzzles involve your typical video gamey things like pushing blocks or pressing switches or pulling levers, while others can get a lot more involved. It never feels unfair though, with even the seemingly complicated V-jolt synthesis becoming child's play once you realize the chemistry puzzle is actually just a math puzzle. Everything in the game is also laid out in a way that keeps you running back and forth through rooms over and over, which means you'll be running past several of the same enemies over and over. And with your ammo limited, especially early on, you'll have to make careful decisions of which enemies to kill and which ones to just avoid. Enemies can't follow you from room to room or even up or down stairs, but since you're likely to visit many areas more than once anyway, it's always a choice you're left to juggle with. For instance, you may have to run through this hallway several times, but it's also wide enough that the slow zombies here don't actually pose that much of a threat as long as you're quick. Meanwhile, you may only need to visit these bedrooms and offices once to grab new key items, but the cramped nature of these quarters means the single zombie within them can pose a real danger regardless. Sure, you can take 2 or 3 zombie bites before you have to really start worrying, but you'd probably rather save your limited healing resources for boss fights. But despite their resilience and their tendency to trick the player by pretending to be dead, zombies aren't actually the biggest threat to the player's livelihood. There are also zombie dogs that are quick and attack in packs, and zombie crows that can swarm and overwhelm you. But those all pale in comparison to the hunters, introduced roughly halfway through the game. These things are biological abominations that attack hard and fast and are capable of killing you instantly as soon as you're below half health. The labs at the end of the game also host chimeras, horrifying animal-human-bug hybrid things that can crawl along walls and ceilings and cling to your back to briefly incapacitate you. While zombies can be easily taken out with a shotgun if you aim right for their heads, these two are the enemies you actually need to be saving your heavier firepower for. The game's bosses, though, are probably the least interesting enemies to face. Resident Evil already doesn't have great combat. It's very stiff, for one thing, but the fixed camera angles can often mess with your sense of perspective, and at least in the game's original release, your character doesn't have any sort of auto-aim. Thankfully, the game designers accounted for this by almost always giving the player the option to avoid combat if they really need to. But the bosses don't offer that luxury. While there is one boss early on where you can just choose to grab the key item and bail, you're pretty much forced to contend with all the others. And this really only highlights how uninvolved that actual process is. Every boss fight, including the final boss, essentially just consists of you standing in one place and firing your strongest weapon, pausing to dodge an attack and/or keep some distance, and repeating that until the boss dies. It doesn't completely ruin the game or anything, but it does sort of hinder the game's horror aspect when every boss is such a pushover. Probably the most contentious thing about Resident Evil in the modern day are the so-called tank controls. With the game using preset camera angles, your directional inputs aren't in relation to the screen, but to your character. Pressing up will always move your character in the direction they're facing, down will cause them to back up, and left and right will turn them to their left or their right. Being one of the earliest examples of a 3D video game, there wasn't yet any industry standard for how 3D games should control, and these tank controls are usually the biggest barrier to entry for new players going back to these games today. They definitely take some getting used to. Characters feel slow to respond to your inputs, but are also somehow weightless. It's sometimes been described as feeling like your characters are skating. Your turns are always going to be wide and sluggish, with 180-degree turns basically impossible. But with enough practice, it does start to become second nature, and it's not like the game isn't designed around this. Enemies tend to be somewhat slow and predictable, and that's to account for the way the controls work. Tank controls are something that would almost surely never be done today, but back then they were just another experiment of the Wild West of 3D gaming while devs were figuring things out, and they would stick around for a surprising number of years before being more or less retired for good. In many ways, Resident Evil is laid out much like those old FMV games, in that it's a choose-your-own-adventure game with multiple story paths and endings. The difference here being that the adventure part is represented through actual gameplay instead of cutscenes. You're given the option of playing as either Jill Valentine or Chris Redfield, each telling their own unique stories that do not overlap. Both campaigns have multiple different routes the player can take through the game that will alter the course of the story, resulting in one of 4 different endings for each character. Your character choice also affects certain gameplay elements. Even though Chris does have more total health than Jill, and gets access to a flamethrower for a brief portion of the game, his campaign is actually the more difficult one. Jill can carry 2 extra items with her, can find a bazooka that looks awfully like a grenade launcher, that fires 3 different specialized ammo types that look awfully like grenades, and comes inherent with a lockpick that allows her to open certain doors and desk drawers that Chris would otherwise need to lug around keys for. Chris doesn't even get free access to the lighter, which you'd expect if you played later entries. Jill also gets access to 1 or 2 major shortcuts that Chris can't use, and has fewer enemies to deal with in general. In fact, in the Japanese version, the characters were actually labeled easy and hard, but for whatever reason this was removed over here. Each of the 2 characters has their own recurring helper character that pops up over the course of their campaign. In Jill's case, Barry Burton may show up to bail her out of hopeless situations, and in Chris's case, Rebecca Chambers can provide a few free heals, and is even playable for certain short segments in order to aid Chris. Each character can also rescue the opposite playable character from a jail cell late in the game as long as they acquire hidden MO discs first. Which of the 4 endings you get is determined by which of these characters, if any, are still alive at the end, and whether your helper character dies or not is determined by the decisions you make over the course of the story. Resident Evil has a lot of branching story paths. In fact, I don't think people seem to realize how many different story variations Resident Evil has. I feel like most players just tend to find one path through the game that works for them, or they just use one specific walkthrough and then do that same exact path every time. But in the opening mansion portion especially, there's actually a lot of open-ended game design going on. Just look at this story breakdown chart. Jill can completely avoid the first scripted zombie encounter, for instance, and doing so will give the zombie time to more thoroughly devour Kenneth's body. She can choose to get the shotgun early, which will also unlock a scene that gives her additional bazooka ammo, but if she instead chooses to get the bazooka early, she'll miss out on those additional acid rounds. In Chris's story, you can meet Rebecca in one of 2 possible locations, and that will affect where and when she'll show up for the rest of the game. You can even guarantee Rebecca's survival in your first meeting with her if you make the right dialogue choices, but doing so will mean she won't stick around to heal your injuries. Hell, in Jill's story, it's actually possible to take a path that almost entirely skips over Barry's entire subplot. Depending on your story path, you'll either have instances of Barry being very helpful towards Jill, or instances of Barry acting very suspicious. The game wants you to feel doubt towards Barry so that perhaps you're less likely to trust him the further you go, which could quite possibly lead to his death later on. But it's possible to take a route through the game that avoids nearly every instance of suspicious behavior from Barry, making that sort of a non-factor. The endgame plot twist reveals that STAR's Alpha Team leader, Albert Wesker, had actually orchestrated the entire incident, and that he'd blackmailed Barry into helping him. But the first time I played this game all those years ago, that reveal sort of fell flat because I never saw Barry doing anything weird. So when Wesker was all like, Barry was working for me the whole time, I was just like, okay. To be fair, I feel like that isn't entirely the fault of the game's story. The writing, sure, but not necessarily the story. The development of Resident Evil was somewhat troubled, initially expected to last around 18 months, but ultimately taking 27, and for most of that time, the team struggled to come up with a satisfactory story. Early drafts featured sci-fi elements that one member of the team said felt more like something you'd see in a Mega Man game than a horror story, and so those initial drafts would be thrown out, with the writing team basically restarting from scratch. Many story elements and scripts were rushed out last minute, with the October 1995 build of the game, just 5 months removed from the game's release the following March, still missing the entirety of Jill's campaign. The game's intro and ending scenes were filmed in live action, and the results are gloriously, lovably terrible. The Japanese crew in charge of these didn't care about making these things look professional. They just wanted to do a quick and easy shoot locally in Tokyo to save on costs, and they put basically no effort into finding qualified actors, instead just hiring the first foreigners who showed up to the auditions regardless of their talent. To this day, we still don't know who many of these people were, and the actress who played Jill was actually still in high school at the time. In many cases, the actors hired for the live action were different from those doing the voice acting, meaning the live action footage was also dubbed over, resulting in this cheesy Godzilla-esque feel to the whole thing.
Joseph! No! Don't go! Jill, run for that house!
But even outside of the live action, all of the game's cutscenes retain this low-budget B-movie quality. The voice acting is stilted and hilarious, actors put emphasis in weird places, and each character's body language doesn't at all match up with what they're actually saying.
Look at those monsters!
Oh, Jill, this house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
It's me, Chris.
Is that you, Rebecca?
It's Forrest. Oh my God.
Chris? Stop it.
Is that Jill?
Is that voice Enrico's?
Yeah?
You're alive!
Wait there! Are you with anybody, Jill?
What? Oh, yes!
Enrico!
So, Barry and Jill together.
What? Oh no! Sorry.
The localized script also has such a flimsy grasp on the English language that there are times where I can't even tell what characters are trying to say. Like, I've heard Wesker's villain monologue at the end of the game dozens of times over the years, and to this day, his plan still doesn't make any sense to me, and this doesn't seem like an issue with the story, it strictly feels like the result of poor translation and poor acting. There's also, of course, the infamous Master of Unlocking and Jill Sandwich lines, which are comedy gold in the sense that they aren't anything any native English speaker would ever think to say.
Here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the Master of Unlocking, take it with you. That was too close. You were almost a Jill Sandwich.
Right.
So, Resident Evil is fascinating in that it is this innovative, ambitious work, while simultaneously an awkward, low-budget production that comes off as incredibly corny. Those pre-rendered backgrounds and fixed camera angles do a great job of building tension, and 80% of the screen being a JPEG means that the game runs consistently smooth. But it also gives the whole thing this sort of green screeny quality, with characters feeling somewhat disconnected from the world they're in. Capcom at least had enough sense to give the characters drop shadows so they don't feel completely out of place, something Donkey Kong Country apparently couldn't figure out. But while they put a lot of thought into the textures and lighting of each environment, they didn't put a lot of thought into the actual details of each room. The mansion is devoid of a lot of furniture and knickknacks. The entire game feels barren and empty, and while I can't say that feels intentional, I can say it does contribute to the game's unsettling atmosphere. And I think that's what makes the game work. The corny acting and dialogue on the surface clashes so harshly with the game's intended tone, but much like a David Lynch film, you begin to realize that that's sort of what makes the whole thing feel strange. Everyone is acting so bizarre that the bad acting sort of becomes good acting. The music goes a long way to contributing to the horror feel as well. While the boss themes can get a bit cheesy, and the ending theme sounds like something from Sonic Adventure for some reason, the environmental themes that accompany the game's exploratory segments do a great job at keeping the horror vibes despite everything else. Overall, the cheap, low-budget look and feel of the game is something that somehow works when applied to the genre of horror. And to be clear, the horror in Resident Evil can be genuinely effective. Monsters can approach you from off-screen or ambush you through windows or leap around corners, but even outside of shallow jump scares, there's a lot of unsettling things going on under the surface. Throughout the game, you can find various memos scattered around that serve as additional lore or foreshadowing. These are what really lay out the underlying conspiracy that serves as the crux of the game's plot, and there are a few that are written from the perspective of mansion residents that have since become the Walking Dead. The Itchy Tasty journal entry is downright chilling, chronicling the final days of a man as he gradually loses his humanity in the aftermath of being unwittingly used as a science experiment. It's become iconic not only within the realm of Resident Evil, but horror as a whole. But even being a horror game didn't save Resident Evil from some censorship. The opening FMV has gotten several revisions throughout all the game's regions and re-releases. Some are in color, others in black and white. Some show graphic images of mangled body parts, others just cut to some newspapers. Some drag out the scene with the dogs attacking Joseph, others cut away early. And of course, we can't let the American kiddos see Chris Redfield lighting up a cigarette, no sir. Outside of the opening though, censorship seems fairly minimal. They cut one shot near the beginning of the game where we see Kenneth's decapitated head, but otherwise this is still a very gory game, at least for its time. And really, I can't say I'm surprised at these cuts. The mid-90s era of gaming was rife with public backlash and controversy about the overabundance of violence and other questionable content in video games. From Mortal Kombat's over-the-top spine-tearing fatalities, Doom's satanic imagery and gratuitous gore, and Sega CD FMV game Night Trap, which received its own wave of criticism due to... hold on, let me check my notes here. Featuring young women wearing nightgowns. American media has always been pretty prudish, huh? I guess Capcom wanted to avoid some of that smoke, but it all seems for naught considering the game still ended up getting an M rating anyway, and it definitely was not free from media fear-mongering either. The 1997 PC port of Resident Evil would end up being completely uncensored, and was also the only version that let you skip the game's loading door animations. And man, those loading door animations. A good chunk of this game is going to be spent looking at those doors. On the one hand, with how frequently you're moving from room to room in this game, it was absolutely the right call to mask loading screens with an animation like this, and they can provide a nice momentary breather in stressful moments, but on the other hand, the sheer amount of loading screens can't help but feel like a pacebreaker a lot of the time. And even though the game doesn't factor those loading screens into your endgame playtime, I often wonder what percentage of my time with this game is actually spent on loading screens. Nonetheless, the non-linear backtrack-heavy game design means Resident Evil shares quite a lot in common with the Metroidvania genre. The game is very tightly paced, loading screens notwithstanding, being built not for longevity, but for replayability, if the game's multiple campaigns, branching story paths, and alternate endings didn't already clue you into that. Resident Evil is a game that truly shines on replays. Going in blind, your first playthrough is likely to be very clumsy and stressful, but repeat plays can often be finished in just a fraction of the time, as you've grown more confident in solving the game's puzzles and dealing with the game's enemies now that you know how slow they are. A first playthrough of the game could last as long as 15 hours, but once you've gotten the hang of things, repeat plays could easily take as little as 3 hours. And you don't even need to learn any exploits or complicated speedrun strats to pull that off. It can be done just by organically learning the game and what is and is not required of you. The game is built to be beaten quickly. And in fact, finishing the game in less than 3 hours unlocks a rocket launcher with infinite ammo for your next playthrough, essentially granting the player a god mode. Additionally, finishing the game with a character's best ending will reward you with the key to the mansion's closet, which allows your character to change into an alternate outfit just in case you want to switch things up a bit. The game is designed around its shortcomings. The tank controls don't feel unfair because the enemies and traps are placed in ways that give you more than enough time to react to them. The load screens don't feel intrusive because no room of the game feels extraneous. Each one has something to see, or some clue to find, or some item to grab. At the same time, learning the game inside and out through repeat plays will still teach you which rooms are safe to ignore if you so choose. You don't have to bother with the MO discs if you don't care about breaking Chris or Jill out of prison. And the endgame evacuation sequence and rematch with the Tyrant only occurs if you get one of the good endings, so you can use that knowledge to shave off a minute or two. And in Chris's campaign, even though he doesn't have a lockpick to get into desk drawers like Jill does, the items found by using desk keys are all non-essential resources that you don't have to seek out unless you're desperate for them. While Chris may find it necessary to seek out the powerful Magnum, even if it means getting through a horde of hunters, Jill may find that the bazooka is more than sufficient and can save herself the hassle. The V-Jolt chemical can be used to weaken Plant 42, allowing you to defeat it with fewer shots, but you may decide that the time spent synthesizing the chemical and pouring it on the roots isn't actually worth all the trouble. And if you're okay with being a bit heartless, you can choose to bail on Richard as he succumbs to the giant snake's poison, letting the timer run out so you can save the antidote for yourself. All these tiny decisions can add up to some pretty wide variations in overall routing and playtime. Resident Evil is a game that not only rewards replays, but expects them. That being said, there were a few instances where the game design did seem to stumble just a bit. For one, the default text speed is agonizingly slow, and holding down the button doesn't make it all that much faster. The text you've been seeing throughout this video, that's with me speeding it up. Any cutscene that isn't pre-rendered or live action is also completely unskippable, which can make replays drag a bit. The original release also lacks auto-aim, and I learned that this was apparently a last-minute change during development, and that most of the game was designed with a built-in auto-aim. Removing it was just an attempt to make the game more difficult, I guess? Beats me. The fact that you can't swap out grenade types for the bazooka until you've fired all of your current stock makes it tricky to use the different ammo types strategically when you actually need to. The amount of poison-healing blue herbs the game throws at you is almost comical when you take into account that there are only like 3 enemies in the entire game that can actually poison you. The game is typically pretty good about providing you with a map for each area early on to help you navigate, except for the underground tunnels for some reason, where the map is placed so that you'll grab it just as you're leaving. And while puzzle solutions and current objectives are usually communicated to the player fairly organically, there were 2 instances where they just had some text pop up on screen to straight up tell you what to do next, which to me screams of playtesters getting lost and the level designers just throwing their hands up in the air and admitting that they had no idea how to fix it. Also, while I wouldn't consider this a flaw per se, it's kind of funny that you spend the entire opening mansion segment of the game hunting down these crests to unlock this door, only to find that it leads to a completely mundane tool shed. The residents must really not be fond of their gardeners or something. It's also worth noting that the aforementioned unlockable secret items only carry over into your very next playthrough, and are lost unless you make sure to get them every time. For the infinite launcher, I kinda get it. It's essentially a cheat item, and maybe they want to limit that. But unlocking the closet key requires you get a character's best ending, which you may not want to do every time. And I don't know, it seems weird to keep what is just a cosmetic change perpetually dependent on the player's performance. I feel like unlocking it once should be enough to have it every time. And while I'm on the subject of the endings, while the best endings are called as such because they feature the most characters surviving, I personally think the simple good endings are actually more interesting from a storytelling perspective. Jill's good ending especially, since it gives some final bits of closure to Barry's subplot. And unlike a lot of fans, I'm actually completely okay with the game not having any one canon scenario. Chris and Jill's campaigns cannot coexist side by side, since they blatantly contradict one another, but I always got the impression that the canon story is some mix between the two, and that leaves a lot of room for personal interpretation, which I really like in a choose-your-own-adventure style game like this. Because of sequels, we know that Jill, Chris, Barry, and Rebecca all do survive the incident in the mansion, but the specific details are left up to the audience, and if you ask me, that's really cool. Despite doubts from Capcom execs about how well an M-rated horror IP would sell, particularly in the States, Resident Evil would prove to be a hit, and one of the PlayStation's earliest killer apps. Reviews were almost universally positive, noting that the game was gripping, well-paced, and genuinely scary at times, and despite its surface-level similarities to Alone in the Dark, Resident Evil managed to forge its own identity and felt like a completely unique experience. The game became instant franchise material as Capcom's newest flagship IP, with a sequel greenlit almost immediately, and the series would become a staple of gaming's early 3D era. This was the first 3D game I played for this video series, and that leap from 2D to 3D, even experienced retroactively in this little microcosm, felt massive. Just the fact that I had an actual Z-axis made it feel like I had jumped forward in time a good 10 years. Despite its cheesy acting and writing, Resident Evil represents the moment gaming as a medium began to mature and come into its own as an art form, both in the sense that it's what an average teenager thinks adult media is like, and in the sense that it had gameplay mechanics and structure that were a bit more sophisticated than what a lot of us were used to. Plus, it was a video game about zombies, which, believe it or not, was actually a pretty unique idea back then. It embodied the corny, low-budget spirit of those early 90s FMV games, while still standing as a strong, interactive experience, even when you take the cutscenes out of the equation. It was a scrappy but earnest attempt at creating a horror movie in video game form, and despite its shortcomings, it laid the groundwork other horror games would build upon for decades to come.